Hey YouTube, today I want to talk about Blaster Master, not to be confused with
Master Blaster.
or
Master Blaster!
Released in 1988 for the NES, Blaster Master was developed and published by Sunsoft, and originally released in Japan for the Famicom as Metafight. Yeah, we'll go with that. Metafight featured a completely different plot than its North American counterpart. In the original game, you play as a boy named Kane Gardner who is leading the counterattack against an evil galactic overlord. The North American release, however, changes this plot entirely to the much more plausible story of Jason, a boy with very poor impulse control who follows his escaped pet frog Fred down a hole that opens in his backyard after Fred lands on an abandoned box of radioactive something, not 20 feet from his house. 'Cause, you know,
America.
When Jason lands at the bottom of the hole, he discovers an armored suit and battle tank called Sophia that he immediately uses to pursue Fred, blasting off into a giant underworld full of radioactive mutants and cybernetic enemies. One of the first things you're going to notice is that Sophia can jump, and also fire in 3 directions, which will come in handy later. Now I know you may be tempted to go down there and blast that guy, and I can't fault you for it. Hell, I've done it myself, but it's an almost certain death if you can't get out in time, and you will take damage just from being down there. Controlling Sophia is easy as long as you remember that the wheels tend to skid. Pressing backwards on the D-pad when you jump will prevent you from sliding over the next ledge. It's worth mentioning that you can fire while in midair at enemies behind you even as you are jumping forward. I first came across this game at a relative's house one summer and I was captivated. I hadn't seen anything like it before. You might wonder why the box says Authentic Arcade Edition. There was a planned arcade version, but it never got off the ground, and even if there was, I doubt it would play like the NES version. Your basic weapon inside the tank is the cannon, but there are additional weapons that can be found while exploring, such as homing missiles and thunder brakes, which basically lets you shoot lightning out of your ass. You can also exit the tank anytime you want, but it's not advisable as large falls can kill and you are much more vulnerable against enemy attacks. After exploring and shooting at things, you will eventually come across a door that requires you to exit the tank. Once you go through, you will now find that the game has changed to a top-down perspective, and your character, once tiny, is now much larger. These areas are good places to look for power-ups for your own weapons as well as Sophia. These areas are also where you will encounter boss battles. That sound has always filled me with dread. You know something big is about to go down and your ass is on the line. There are some very interestingly designed enemies in this game. Just look at this thing. After defeating a boss, you will gain a new upgrade for your tank. These upgrades will allow you to gain entry to the next area. Ultimately, you gain the abilities to drive up walls and hover. Graphically, this is one of the best looking NES games there is. The side-scrolling portions showcase massive environments and each area has its own unique look. Mossy areas with entangled foliage give way to clean stony and metallic industrial areas. The top-down areas give us large sprites and massive bosses. This is considered a fairly difficult game, and for good reason. The backtracking can be a bit of a hindrance, and some areas that you explore are unnecessary to complete the game. The manual includes a very simple map that isn't much help. Some of the bosses can be pretty difficult if you don't have your gun upgraded. If you enjoy open world exploration in the vein of Metroid, then you probably won't mind it. I'd like to take this time to point out this is my actual gameplay footage fighting the Area 2 boss, the first giant crab. For some reason, I just never got past this guy as a kid, but I beat him here, 20 years later. It took me 20 years to beat that crab. But I digress. The soundtrack by Japanese composer Naoki Kodaka features some of the best music from the NES era. The music from Areas 1 and 2 are my personal favorites. Kodaka also wrote music for several other popular titles by Sunsoft. Blaster Master was also novelized for the Scholastic Worlds of Power series of books based on NES games. I actually had this one as a kid, but some dick stole it. An interesting side note to this is that the plot used in the novelization actually wound up becoming the plot for Blaster Master 2 for the Sega Genesis. While considered by many to be a difficult game, there is a lot of fun to be had here. A great graphical presentation, an excellent soundtrack, tight control, and fun varied gameplay. That being said, there isn't really much of a story, and some of the enemies are extremely difficult to kill. I'm looking at you, robotic slug. Yeah, I know, you can just use the homing missiles on them, but sometimes you run out, and they do love to gang up on you. There were several more games in the series after that, including a remake of the original game for the Virtual Console called Blaster Master Overdrive. So if you like the idea of blasting radioactive mutant monsters in the face with a big-ass tank, but also enjoy the open-world aspect of games like Metroid, give it a shot. Crap.